My name is Bamidele Osamika, as I said, and I'm the Regional Climate Collaborative Manager here at Green Umbrella. Green Umbrella is a regional climate collaborative for Greater Cincinnati. We have been serving as a backbone for environmental and sustainability work for the past 25 years. Over the years, we've connected hundreds of members, nonprofit, businesses, academic institutions, as well as local government and passionate individuals through our impact collective approach to our sustainability work. So we've connected them so that they can also be to get engaged in as we tackle environmental challenges in our communities. This webinar is titled Climate Health Equity Series, and specifically we'll be looking at the climate change, extreme weather events, and health outcomes. The webinar is going to kickstart with introduction, and it's 1 hour and hopes to explore the connections between climate change, extreme weather events, and health outcomes in Greater Cincinnati. Our panelists will make a brief presentation, followed by a Q&A, then the next steps, and we're going to make some announcement. With the recent change in Green Umbrella identities from Regional Sustainability Alliance to Regional Climate Collaborative, Green Umbrella joins more than 30 other collaboratives across the country, all of them working cross-jurisdictional climate action work, given our staff and existing programs and our partnership that we have established over the years. For the past 25 years, Green Umbrella is now the largest regional climate collaborative in the country. Myself, Bamidele Noel, Nobi Kennedy, who is a regional climate collaborative coordinator, and Savannah Sullivan, who is the director of strategy, with working together on this regional climate effort. So Green Umbrella serves the 10-county region across Southwest Ohio, Northern Kentucky, and Southeast Indiana. Alongside with other staff, so we have a climate health fellows, who is Mitch Stingo, who is the 40-year medical student at the University of Cincinnati Medical School, and Leas Rose, who is also an undergraduate student at the medical school at University of Cincinnati. Climate Health Equity webinar series is built on a recently completed report done in partnership with Scioto Analysis to highlight the major findings of this report and also to accelerate actions on the key related issues. We have released public service announcement toolkit, which is connected to the topic we're going to be treated here. And also, please visit our website and other social media platforms to download the full report and also to read about this report. This public service announcement covers 11 climate health topics, one per month, and it provides a shareable and data materials every month. Additionally, this campaign also shares actionable strategies at the individual, institutional, and also system level. This month climate campaign covers climate change, extreme weather events, and health outcomes in Greater Cincinnati. And as a matter of fact, this month it is sixth in this webinar series. So do you know that over the past years, the numbers of extreme weather events in Ohio has increased significantly? And this is expected to kind of increase further as climate changes. So the greatest threats that we have in this region is tornado. We heard yesterday about what's really happening around the region. And in 2050, FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Agency, estimate about 80 million population expected annualized loss for the Cincinnati metropolitan area, with an additional 7.5 deaths annually due to extreme weather events. So importantly, elderly people, people living in rural areas, white people, and native of Pacific Islands are most vulnerable people to these events. Then what can you do? What can I do? What can institution do to really get people prepared and take actionable steps to really get prepared ahead of these things? Then I'm going to be introducing a panelist who is going to talk more about this and also discuss more about it. So on the call, we have two. So the first is going to make a brief presentation is Jim Noel. Jim Noel is the first panelist. So he's currently a service coordinator and coordination hydrologist at NOAA, which is the National Weather Service Ohio River Forecast Center. He started his National Weather Service in 1992, and he has been with the OHRFC since 1996 as hydrologist. His degrees and education are from Northern Illinois University and the Ohio State University. Its main focus areas includes climate forecasting, climate variability, climate change, precipitation estimates, and forecasting. He has taught climate variability and change seminars and rainfall forecasting seminars for NOAA, and has most recently authored a national climate assessment, the fifth one for the United States for the 2023-2024. Join me as I welcome Jim Noel for his presentation.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, I think it's kind of appropriate that we're kind of having this webinar series today, as it's not too often that we get a tropical system barrel to come right over our area, producing some flooding in Indiana and some strong winds across the tri-state area here today. You know, probably once every 4 to 5 years, we'll get some remnants of a tropical system to move through our area. But those are kind of what we're talking about today, extreme events at times like the remnants of Hurricane Ike was back in 2008 that left a lot of the area without power. And I've even was looking at some of the power maps today. There are definitely some power outages going on right now from the remnants of Beryl. So that's kind of appropriate. Also, earlier was shown with the tornadoes. I just wanted to comment that, like, for the state of Ohio now, we have set a record for the most number of tornadoes in a year already for the state for this year. So, so definitely we've had some extreme weather this year, and we're going to kind of talk about that in the next 5 to 10 minutes. So if you move on to the next slide, I'm going to kind of hit the kind of the different elements of weather and climate and how that can affect our health and the equity within the tri-state area. So this is some of the projections from the National Climate Assessment 5 that I was one of the authors for, that was published through the White House at the end of last year. We do that about every 4 years now, looking at the future climate and updating it with the latest science. What you're seeing on this image is basically the left image is the number of days above 95 degrees. So that's very impactful to urban areas, but it also is impactful on agriculture, cattle, all that thing. So it's a wide range of impacts when you get temperatures above 95. And we're projecting those number of days to be increasing with just a modest increase in our temperatures. The middle image is the number of cold days, which are forecast to decrease. And then the right image is basically the number of warm nights. And I think this is the most important one to the tri-state area, because what we found is, especially when nighttime lows are above 80, it's very impactful to our health and well-being. And those definitely are projected to increase, and they have been increasing over the last 20 to 30 years and are projected to continue to increase over the next several decades. Moving on to the next slide. So this is kind of an example. The left image is the upper Ohio Valley and the right image is the lower Ohio Valley. So we kind of sit in between. But if we look for on this plot, the colors are kind of broken down to like periods in time. So the historical period back in the before 2000 basically is that kind of purplish color at the bottom left of each image. And then going forward out to the end of the century, we see the rising temperatures. Basically what this is showing is that we're seeing about a half-degree increase to almost a degree Fahrenheit increase per decade across the region, both observed and then projected. And so in a nutshell, what that's going to do is we're going to be moving like Interstate 64 temperatures down in central Kentucky, north all the way to Interstate 70. So we're going to be basically shifting climate from south of Cincinnati metro area to north of Cincinnati metro area. As we move through this century, which is very impactful because you're going to influence a lot of things, including heat islands and the impact to heat and temperatures on people. I'm moving on to the next slide. So a few things when we try to relate, like, and many of you have seen this before, but it's the whole idea of heat and health equity is it's not equal. Most of the heat is really concentrated in urban areas where you have concrete brick buildings and that's very impactful. Again, especially on the nighttime lows, we like to focus as a culture on how hot it's going to be. Like, you might see on the news where it's going to be up to 100 degrees tomorrow, but it's very impactful if you're starting out really high. So when it comes to in any area where you have concrete, it's impacting your energy costs. Inner cities have less trees, so you have more concrete, more heat, which means more impact to the energy usage, but also it's vulnerable people in those areas that are very potentially impacted from that heat because, again, can they cool off? So as we move forward in this century, when we're talking about extreme weather, remember the number of people that are killed in the United States, the number one killer is actually heat. It's not cold, it's not tornadoes, it's not floods, it's not hurricanes, it's actually heat. And that includes our tri-state area as well. I'm moving on to the next slide. There are definitely several extreme weather patterns. We are at the crossroads of the jet stream here in the Ohio Valley, meaning we kind of receive all of these different extremes. So we have heat, we also have rainfall. It is one of the biggest impactful things to the tri-state area is floods. We're expecting the wetness that we've seen really rapidly increase over the last 20 years to continue this century. We've seen annual rainfall amounts already increase by 2 to 4 inches in the tri-state area. And again, whenever you're having increased rainfall, you're getting vulnerable to how we get water out of, especially urban areas, but it affects even the rural areas. So all of that is very vulnerable when it comes to flooding. Next slide. So one of the big things here in the Ohio Valley in our region of the country is what this slide is showing is the past on the left image and then different scenarios of how much warming we have. And it's the extreme fluctuation in a nutshell of going from drought to floods. Well, in any area that has population, when you don't get rain for a month or two, you start to build up debris in your sewer systems and all that. And then when you do switch from a very dry 30-day or 60-day period to a very wet period, that's when bad things can happen with urban flooding, for example. And what the projections are showing is the risk for more of these extreme switches going back and forth from dry to wet to dry. And that makes our communities more vulnerable, actually, because of like leaves coming down, trash, everything else. It becomes a very complicated system. Next slide. So this is an image of annual flood loss over the last, like in 2020. And if we go back to the previous image there, it basically what it's showing is the amount of loss. And in the Cincinnati metropolitan area, it's more red. If we can go back, it's more red because Cincinnati is a very vulnerable community. If you look at there in Southwest Ohio, Southeast Indiana, Northern Kentucky, this is a national grid, but there's darker red in our tri-state area. So we are very vulnerable. You see that like in Chicago, you see that wherever there's urban areas, but also wherever there's terrain and mountains as well. So bottom line is we get more flood loss in the urban Cincinnati and tri-state area than in surrounding areas. On the right image is a projection through 2050. Even though we're not the darkest green with the biggest increase in flood losses, it's because we already have a bigger number to increase from. So the bottom line is you see the entire tri-state area and the Ohio Valley sees different colors of green, meaning that we expect even additional flood losses in the extremes as we go forward over the next 30 years. Okay, next slide. So this is just an example then in the Cincinnati area of those projections of our river flows. And the bottom line is all of the trends from the past back in the 1900s up through 2100 are all up. Except in the fall time, you'll notice in the lower right, our low flows drop in the lower right image in October in the fall time, but in the lower left, our maximums still increase. The message here is we're going to get more fluctuations and more extremes going again back and forth from floods to droughts. So these extreme fluctuations that stresses our system, stresses our health, stresses unequally the urban areas, especially the more inner urban areas versus the rural areas and the suburban areas. Next slide. In addition, with the warming and moistening up of our climate, we're going to be more vulnerable to health impacts in terms of disease. And this in the National Climate Assessment 5, it's broken up into regions of the country. Certainly ticks are on the rise, mosquitoes, all the diseases that come with that. In addition, bacteria impacts will also be on the increase. And there are slight differences between, like, say, our tri-state area versus the southeastern U.S. And there's changes. That's why you don't see the same images in, say, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, as you do, say, further down towards Atlanta, Georgia. But everything is working north. So a lot of the problems of additional disease and impact from insects and all those kind of things, they are shifting north and making us more vulnerable to, some of the things like West Nile and those kind of things that we've seen, or Lyme disease. And those are expected to also projected to continue to increase as well. Next slide. This is just an example of generational inequality. And in the sense of what this image shows is in 3 different warming scenarios in the future, like a modest warming in like a yellow, a moderate warming environment in orange, and a red environment of a significant warming. You have all these different extreme weather scenarios that impact our inequities from urban areas to rural areas. And we're comparing in this image somebody who was born in 1965 versus somebody born in 2020. And everything in general, all the numbers are pretty much, no matter what, are generally up. There's more risk for flooding, for drought, for heat waves, all those kind of things that put stress on our actual urban and suburban and surrounding area systems. So bottom line is the younger generations are going to be more impacted than what at the same age the older generation saw, say, 50, 60 years ago. Next slide. So this is social vulnerability in the past. And certainly if you look at the 3 image of the US in the upper left image, it's showing that, bottom line is in our tri-state area, we have basically considered kind of a medium impact from social vulnerability. And overall, even though the climate sensitive hazards, the losses, the actual economic losses from them have been steady for the most part in our area, going forward, we think that those, loss impacts will be increasing, with aging infrastructure and all those kind of things. Next slide. So this is a community resilience index looking at what we're most resilient at and what we're least resilient at. And you'll see that it's a little hard to see here, but in our area, we put a lot in terms of resiliency into things like our community resiliency, our metropolitan resiliency, which are considered high as part of the National Climate Assessment 5. But with the lowest relative resiliency comes things like aging infrastructure in our area, as well as the environment. So, in the Ohio Valley, for example, I'll just give you one example. We have the most number of aging dams in the country. And so that, again, when you live near waterways and you have old dams, they are more vulnerable to failing. And so we don't have total, equality when it comes to who's living where. And so we become in our urban areas, but even in the rural areas along river systems, we are more vulnerable then to that aging infrastructure. And this is just put in here more in the National Climate Assessment to give us a respect that everything is not equal across the country, and everybody has different challenges when it comes to extreme weather. Certainly one of our big challenges is an aging infrastructure. Next slide. And so I'm kind of finishing up here with adaptation. And so as climate change and extreme weather evolve, we have to be able to adapt better. Certainly the coastal U.S., which has been very impacted by rising sea level and other things such as hurricanes, have been doing a lot more adaptation. In the Ohio Valley, you can kind of see we're kind of in that low to medium range of the amount of adaptation we've been doing when it comes to this. But certainly, when it comes to health and equity, we're going to have to be able to adapt to a changing climate. The climate system is never stable. It's always changing. And so we have to be able to build and deal with this, in a multifaceted way. And I believe next slide, I think that might be all. Yep. So I'll go ahead and turn it back over for Katie Jo.
Thank you, Jim, for your time and those information. So our second panelist is going to be Katie Jo. Katie Jo is an associate director of community development and planning in Northern Kentucky Area Development District. Katie Jo serves as an outreach and development specialist and a strategic initiative manager, which have not only challenged her, but also demonstrated her numerous strengths. She had led economic development organizations in rural communities in Georgia and Kentucky. She began her career as a historic preservation planner for the Coastal Georgia Regional Development Center. Katie Jo received a master's in community planning from the University of Cincinnati and undergraduate degrees from in economics and anthropology from Central College, Danville, Kentucky. She is a proud mom to one son, and will always look at the dessert menu before ordering dinner at a fancy restaurant. Join me as I welcome Katie Jo for our presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. As you heard, I am a planner. I am not a scientist. I am not a weather person. But when we look at our communities, so much of the stuff we do, we're working forward and trying to plan so they are resilient when things happen. So if you can go to the next slide. Just a little background on the Area Development District. We were created by the Kentucky Legislative back in the 70s. We work on quite a few projects in we provided a couple different services, all the way from aging disabilities, community planning, working with finance management, food insecurity, local government services, and workforce development. That allows us to really have a holistic approach to our community and how we provide services throughout the community. So next slide. Part of that holistic approach is really looking at some regional plans that we write and administer and make sure we work with all of our communities to really collaborate with them, empower them, and really convene and get an understanding of what's needed in our region. This is just a short list of those plans. Hazard mitigation, which we'll speak about later, energy resilience, comprehensive economic development strategy, and then some other plans we do is transportation, water management, how we do housing studies, brownfield assessments, and we also are a clearinghouse for our federal grants. Next slide. So again, I mentioned those regional plans that we do. Now, all of our regional plans, as we sit back and look at them and examine them and write them, we've come to realize they all align really well. There are strategies in all of our plans that kind of overlap. Are related to this really is our hazard mitigation plan, which is required by FEMA. Our plan is, within our plan, it's an 8-county plan. We have 60 jurisdictions in that plan. So that is Boone, Kenton, Campbell, Carroll, Gallatin, Grant, Owen, and Pendleton. And so those are 8 diverse counties. And so our plan is very comprehensive, but specific at the same time to be able to help those communities. And you're asked, why is a hazard mitigation plan? Well, as Jim mentioned, there are a lot of things going on, a lot of risks, and this plan really helps our communities be proactive. And so it's not to help them recover after the event, that tornado or that ice storm, but it's really to help them be prepared. So when that event does happen, they can come back online faster. They can rebuild a little bit faster. So that hazard mitigation plan talks about the risk assessment, the mitigation strategies, and then how we update those. Also in this plan is we are now focusing on high hazard dams. Jim mentioned that that's a risk here in our region. And so our plan, we're actually going ahead and really focusing on those to make sure that if something does happen, those who live below that dam are taken care of. When we talk about risk assessments, so this is like the fun part where you get to use all that information that Jim kind of talked about and how things are changing and really understand what those hazards in our communities are and what those threats are. Fortunately, there's some threats that we don't have that much here. Like we don't have volcanoes threats, but we do have earthquake and landslides and thunderstorms. So we just really work to understand what's going on in our community historically and then try to plan for those. Also, when we talk about mitigation resiliency, we talk about energy, like what happens when the power goes off. I know in the past few years, it seems like power goes off a lot often than it does in the past. And so the next slide, we'll talk about our work with our state energy policy office, where we are really understanding what happens when we lose power and what facilities and what critical facilities and stakeholders need to come back online as quick as possible. Again, the next slide. Yes, so we again are working to collect data about what their energy needs are when they lose power, if it's either for an ice storm or a windstorm or thunderstorm, and how to bring that back on. The strategies that we're developing in that plan complement what we've already written in our hazard mitigation plan that FEMA is in charge of and reviews. And so again, it's really making sure that our communities can come back online again as quickly as possible. So those are 2 mitigation plans, more related to weather and those type of disasters, potential disasters. Our next plan, so the next slide, talks about our plan that we write for EDA, so the Economic Development Administration, which is our comprehensive economic development strategy. And I know when you all hear economic development, you think of those big groups. Like here in Northern Kentucky, we have BNKY, which is our regional economic development group, and they bring businesses in. This plan is really not to attract those businesses. It is to make sure that we have the infrastructure to attract those businesses. So Jim mentioned aging infrastructure, aging, for us, it's aging water lines and replacing those lead lines and those terracotta lines with upgrades. And so this plan that we write really focuses on preparing our communities for that next step. And fortunately, preparing them for economic success also helps them if we do have that tornado or we do have flooding or all those natural disasters that could really affect that infrastructure. So again, like I said, it all kind of works together, fortunately for us. And we're not really writing these plans in a vacuum anymore. where we're looking at it holistically. If you go to the next slide. Yeah, again, a holistic approach to regional planning. I mentioned earlier, we have like 6 or 7 plans that we're consistently updating, revising, making big changes to. And so if you go to the next page, slide, it will really talk about what we're trying to incorporate as we move forward. So much of the stuff complements what we're doing, complements the slides that Jim mentioned. So when you talk about the heat and health equity, we're really making sure that we are improving our infrastructure and addressing those vulnerable populations to really make sure that they know what's going on, how to get those services, how to communicate, where those cooling stations are, where if there's a tornado or a hurricane, how to get to a safe spot. And then also, like I said, energy resilience. Then as we look about social vulnerability, we are really understanding how those losses are helping everyone in the future. So we can reduce those losses, especially when it relates to road construction, infrastructure of wastewater, water pumps, water stations, all those things that we don't really think about, but they are very key and important. Some other things that we're looking at when we talk about updating our content and our guidelines are broadband. As we all know, we live by broadband anymore. And if you live in an urban area, you can get high-speed internet. Some of our southern counties, it's not there. I don't know if you've driven south into Kentucky, but you lose cell towers, service. And so we're trying to work on to make sure that everyone has reliable internet and broadband. Also, when we talk about workforce, I know it's really not weather related, but we are so tied to that workforce part where we need to make sure that our employers can come back, if we have an event, can come back online so they can continue producing, but also so those employers and employees can get to that job. So that is a very condensed summary of like why hazard mitigation planning, energy resiliency planning, and economic development planning all relates to weather, because it all can be able to create resiliency and come back online, be able to serve again is a huge thing for our economic development growth and moving forward. That's it.
All right, Katie Jo, thank you very much for the information you just provided. They are really very, very helpful. So at this time, we want to ask questions. So we want the audience to kind of drop question, or you can jump out of the mute and kind of ask if you have a question from our panelists, and the floor is kind of very open now, so to ask questions. So, and they are ready to provide some answers to them. So maybe while we compile the question on the chat, so I just have this 1-2 question to kind of ask, so that you can help us to provide some answers to them. So one of it is, I'm going to ask first from Jim. So what make Greater Cincinnati vulnerable to extreme weather events? I know you talk about it in part of your presentation, but if you can kind of share more light on it, on why the Greater Cincinnati region kind of most vulnerable to extreme weather events.
Yeah, so for the Ohio Valley and especially the tri-state area, you know, like I always say, if you look at it, the Ohio River is where it is and what it's doing for a reason. And that is, we're really at the crossroads of what you may hear sometimes on TV meteorologists talking about the crossroads of the jet stream. And so we are at the classic intersection coming off of dry air off the Rocky Mountains, cold air from Canada, and warm Gulf moisture, not only from the Gulf actually, but also it sometimes actually can come even in from the Atlantic, and they all mix together here. And that's why when you look at some of the statistics where for larger river flooding, for example, some of the worst flooding is Arkansas, Kentucky, West Virginia, and even parts of southern Ohio. At the same time, where the worst tornadoes are, we always, growing up, you'd always hear like Texas and Oklahoma, but there's been a shift in that, and that has crept into parts of southern Indiana and western Kentucky. So when you start overlaying all these extremes, it really works back to is where the intersection of the warm and cold and dry and moist air is. And so that is over us. That's why we get so much rain in a year. You know, we average over 40 to 42 inches of rain. And that's really dry, again, driven by, that's a static thing, and that collision is always going on. And if you look at the National Weather Service, which I'm a part of, which is under the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, our area is some of the busiest in the country. So yes, there are more extremes, say on the Gulf Coast with like hurricanes than here. But as we saw, we're getting impacts from Beryl today, but we are getting so many flavors, from snow to ice to remnants of hurricanes. We just get the whole mixture. That makes us very vulnerable to those extremes, which impacts our health, well-being, equity. All these things are kind of coming together in the Ohio Valley and the tri-state area.
Thank you for those responses. So just in line with excuse me, just in line with one of the question that was posted on the chat, I have another question here for Katie Jo. In line with those, with all these climate disaster or extreme weather events, so what can institutions do, what can individuals do to be more resilient in terms of approach to be prepared ahead of these things?
Well, as an individual, I think you just have to be prepared, have your own weather plan done. But for communities, it is really working on making sure that their infrastructure is good. Some things that we've been working on is, and you forget these small things, but the one is making sure that all of our police stations, fire stations have backup generators so they can come back online. Another thing is, if you have a tornado, we've been working with our communities to really understand where their street signs are, because if we have a tornado and they rip, all the street signs are gone, they don't know what needs to be replaced, what was there before. And so it's just identifying that. Also working with our public utilities to help have them have backup generators or alternative sources to make sure that we still have water. One thing I think we forget, we saw in the winter when we had that big ice storm, well, they shut down the expressways, gas tankers couldn't be delivered, and gas couldn't be delivered to service stations. So then people were running out of gas. It's being able to bring those roads back open as soon as possible. Also, when you lose power, gas stations also lose power, and you can't pump gas to provide those gas to those snow plows if you don't have power to the gas station. It's those things where we're just really being proactive to make sure everyone is prepared just in case if something does happen.
All right, thank you for those wonderful answers. So I have another kind of question for you again. So before I move to Jim to kind of answer. So the question here is that from the chat, so from the audience is, we have about 3,000 to 5,000 buildings damaged by water intrusion each year in Cincinnati. So most of these buildings, they are not on floodplains, but they are mostly overflow by water. So how does the region or the property owner prepare for these flood events as they come in the future?
Right. Most of those floods that are not in a floodplain happens because of development and how that development was done downstream or upstream. That is something that we work with your planning agency, your development agency, to make sure as our community develops, as things are built, torn down, that they really think ahead to address those issues. The other thing is sometimes it could be because stormwater backs up and the storm drains get filled. How do we make sure that to maintain those storm drains? Then the waste management and making sure all the systems are moving ahead. that kind of goes back to aging infrastructure and replacing the aging infrastructure to be able to handle the new requirements or the new stresses that are put on that system. Remember, some in Covington, those systems were put in the early 1900s, and they're just not capable of handling what goes through those systems now. In Covington, when we do have a flood, it floods back into those wastewater, stormwater systems, and along with the wastewater, they kind of mix together. And so again, it's just examining what we have, upgrading that, and replacing it when need be.
All right, thank you very much. So this another question kind of goes to Jim. What what are some of the recommendations you have for the holistic approach to maybe hazard mitigation when or if as we address climate change?
So I would say this, from working with the National Climate Assessment 5 and working with different communities, one of the things that really strikes home to me is what Katie Jo was talking about earlier. And that's it's the real change, and that is holistic, because I think in the United States, growing up, and I just work with a lot of engineers, is we used to try in the US to always engineer our way out of everything. And the problem is that you fix one problem, you have those unintended consequences. And this, I think, moving towards a holistic way of, creating, both a green infrastructure, adding green space in for like flood mitigation. Certainly in Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, flooding is one of our biggest problems, both overland and riverine flooding. I know, like, I was on a meeting with some of the people, and we were talking about how, like, Bloomington, Illinois is doing a lot of, when they do try to fix things, or improve things, they're looking at it more holistically now. And I think, that's what we're seeing. It's not simply mitigating and adapting through only engineering practices kind of thing. I think that's a really important thing to stress, and that's not easy. And that requires my observation. It requires more community versus all the communities working together, because, like Katie Jo was saying, water is routed. So a lot of the extreme weather events, for example, they're at your place, right? If a tornado hits a nursing home, the impact is to seniors at the nursing home. However, a flooding is, I really, Katie Jo hit it on the head. You're downstream, and so you could be very innovative at what you're doing, but you're still at the mercy of what is being done upstream as well. And so it requires that holistic approach.
All right, thank you, Jim, for those wonderful answers. So the last question here is, Midwest, and as a matter of fact, Cincinnati is climate heaven. So a lot of people are kind of moving down to Midwest because it's kind of a safer place among the regions in US. So how do we make sure that become more accessible as people comes around? And also, how do we make sure that especially the vulnerable population, the elderly, the children, the pregnant women, a minoritized population, how do we try to get prepared ahead as a kind of resilient plan to combat any of the extreme events when those things happen?
I'll at least start that question. So I think it's every part of the country doing the Midwest chapter for the National Climate Assessment is understanding your actual real risks. Like Katie Jo was saying, we don't really have like volcano risks here. But even though we have risks like to earthquakes and everything, they're not all equal. So as people in the US migrate to different parts of the country and then maybe re-migrate back over time, there's been a huge migration to the south, and it's extreme heat down there, and there's a lot of hazards. you know, we were looking at in the National Climate Assessment that there was discussions on that of like potentially in the Midwest and the Great Lakes where actually there could be a reversal to where populations could be moving, because in some respects we have less risk of some things and more of others. So like, again, in our area, flooding is a huge risk. So it's ensuring that whenever we, how we communicate from, say, federal, state, local governments to, and cities and all that to the people in the areas, it's making sure we're communicating. I know we hear this over and over. Whenever we do an after action review or a service assessment of a significant extreme weather event, we hear it over and over. It's all about communication. It's communication between governments. It's communication between governments and citizens. So the more you do in terms of preparedness and communication, I think is extremely, you know, it is important because if we do not communicate well on what those risks are. I'll give you one example. I was at a flood summit with FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency in Chicago. And historically, we've always looked at flood risk by the number of claims put in by people that actually have national flood insurance. But when a national natural disaster is declared by the president and FEMA, others file in with claims. And when you look at it that way, they were saying that historically, the southern US was always insured for flooding more so, like Houston, New Orleans, all those southern cities because of hurricanes and that. A lot more people bought national flood insurance through the National Flood Insurance Program, for example. So the attention was that those cities were most impacted by flooding. But when you look at national federal declarations of a natural disaster for flooding, cities like Chicago, Detroit, and even Cincinnati pop up in that when you can file under a natural disaster claim. And so understanding our risk, I think, is really important, because I say this always, do we really know where we are on the risk curve? I think as humans, we think we know where we are and we're more confident of risk than we really know. And that's a fundamental problem, because if you don't truly understand your risk and assign the risk appropriately, it is very difficult to adapt, mitigate, become resilient, and make changes properly for those risks. So going forward, the risk for, like, you know, heat is a real risk in the Ohio Valley. The risk for flooding is a real risk. And even though there's risk from earthquakes, for example, that risk is much lower than the day-to-day risk we have. Last thing I do want to say on this is that's really important is we could build every dam to the 1,000-year flood, but economically that's not realistic. So again, it's how we interact with being realistic to what that risk actually is. So we need to look at all these risks that, like I was talking about today, from heat to floods to drought to everything else, and making sure that we assign the risk appropriately.
Thank you, Jim. So, Katie Jo, do you have last thought about that?
Well, I think Jim talked about risk assessment and our hazard mitigation plan. It is probably the largest section of our entire document, where we look at what's happened in the past, the historic events for all those threats that we see in northern Kentucky, assess those, and then really provide next steps related to those risks. So when you have 60 communities, which FEMA requires us to work with all 60 of them and have participation for all 60 of them, it's a lot. Some of those risks and events are the same. As you all know, a tornado doesn't really understand a city limit or a county limit, and it just goes across and all those lines. And that's another reason why we really focus on doing these plans regionally, holistically. And then also when we talk about vulnerable populations, historically if we do have an event, we hear the tornado sirens, or you get the alert on the phone, or there's something on TV. Well, the way we're getting information now is changing. So Some people don't even have TVs. They get it on their phones. They don't hear the sirens. And so we're working on making sure to change the mindset of how we provide that information, those notices, and that information in real time to all of our populations. So we're working to not just get that weather alert out in English, but then also get that in other languages. For Northern Kentucky, those two other languages are French and Spanish. And so those people who are coming to our region that don't speak English as a primary language and might not understand what that tornado siren means, educating them on what their response should be, where they should go for a safe space, and making sure that everyone has the knowledge to protect themselves and if there is an event.
Right. Thank you, Katie Jo. Really appreciate both of you on this call and everyone that attended this webinar. So please, if you have more questions, you can connect with our panelists. So we have their email address on the screen. So the next step, so moving forward from here, we just to reemphasize what our panelists have said. So for individual, we want to build emergency kits like personal plan and just ahead of time, listen to and also follow local weather advisory. Do not try to overrun a tornado in a car, avoid flood water, and also plan wind resistant trace. So for institutions, we the more resilient climate strategy, we kind of to emphasize now is to we update our building codes, and communities should invest in critical infrastructure, including healthcare, especially for the vulnerable population, housing, climate smart agriculture, and also invest in green infrastructure initiatives. We want the government to also should designate more funds to hazard mitigation plans, including climate and resilient plans. So we have a couple of announcements to make, which we're going to drop the link on the charts for us to also click on each of those things and also learn more. So by July 24th, we'll be having a candidate education summit. So we want our elected officials and also the stakeholders to kind of be on the call. That same time is going to be 12 to 1:30 p.m. So please register, visit our website to register. The link is also being dropped at the chat now. So August 8th, we have a local government and climate action showcase. So presently we have climate action fellowship. So with 3 cities. So for that August 28th, is going to be a showcase here at the digital feature of the building. So please join us between 3 to 4:30 p.m. So look at the showcase to see exactly projects that all our climate fellows have done over the summer. Also, that same day, we'll be joining and together with other fellows for that day at the Green Drinks with Green Umbrella staffs, and also at the Summerest venue. So between 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. So for August 12th, we have Rehab Action Team, so which is for through our food council policy program. So they'll be having a food system resources sharing session. So between 3 to 4:30 p.m. So we have our next climate health equity webinar series by August 19th. So next month. So please join us. It's going to be an exciting topic. It's going to be looking at air quality and health outcomes that day. So please join us. And also visit our website at greenumbrella.org to get engaged and also participate in the environmental work that we are doing. So in a couple of last minutes we have on the call, so we want to drop a survey so that we can fill. As I said earlier, this is the 6th edition for this year. So we want to hear from all our audience, especially for those who will be attending, and also to hear from our panelists about their experience on this call and also feedback. So we really appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us today, and see you next month on another exciting topic.